of Kentucky Ancestors, and I believe there are a few copies of the latest issue of Kentucky Ancestors sitting down on the table. That's the genealogical quarterly of the Kentucky Historical Society. The offices of in Frankfurt, as you probably well know. He's a native of Harrodsburg, and he graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he majored in military history, and he served a 24-year active duty career in the United States Air Force, and that is certainly something to be commended. He began working at the Thomas D. Clark Center for Kentucky History in April of 2007, and he became editor of the Kentucky Ancestors in January of 2008. Kentucky history and the Civil War in particular have been one of Don's lifelong interests. Now, Don told me one other time that he was in the same Air Force class as, what was the pilot that sat down in the Hudson River?
Sully Sullenberger.
Sully Sullenberger. So that's great. Two pilots that were just marvelous together. All right. So without any further ado, let me give you Don Rightmyer.
Let me say that it's a real honor for me to be here tonight to share with you. And someone did ask me earlier if I had been a long time a student of the Civil War, and I said, well, if third grade's early enough, yeah. I'm 62 now, so that's pretty long. But I will have to say that tonight's topic is probably one of the most interesting of all the things, and I'm very broad in my interest in history, but I hope tonight that some of you have come with some preconceptions about Kentucky's experience in the Civil War, and I hope that you'll leave with some different ones. Because I think, and I really enjoy it, because I think Kentucky had the most unique experience of any state in the entire Civil War, and I think you'll know why I feel that way in just a minute when I share with you. I want to just share some basic generalized statements about the Civil War that you might think tonight as we talk about that. And one of the things is that if you would think about the Civil War, and we are, as was mentioned in the announcement about this talk, in the 150th commemoration or observance of the Civil War having occurred, one of the things that you might think is that all states were either on the south side of the South or the North. Another thing you might assume was that all Union soldiers wore blue uniforms and all Confederate soldiers wore gray uniforms. Another one would be that if you were alive at that time and you were in favor of slavery, if you were for slavery, therefore you would be pro-Confederate. And you might assume that if you were against slavery, you would then be pro-Union. And the last one that you might assume tonight in thinking about the Civil War is that all Union soldiers fought to end slavery. So having said that, let's launch into my talk. I know we're time constrained. We have to be out in time because the library closes at 9. So if you all wouldn't mind holding your questions to the end, and I promise you I'll provide time for questions, and I'll try to answer those. And then as we're still milling around and when people are leaving, if you still have questions, I'll be available. So I'll try to go through this, and hopefully there will be some questions that might be generated. The other thing I want to say very quickly before I launch my talk, the maps that I brought you tonight are actually a historical artifact. If you'll look very closely at these, you'll notice that the text in this map was written by Joe Creason, who's been passed away for quite some time. These are actually maps that were put out by the state of Kentucky for the centennial celebration of the Civil War back in 1961. So you all actually have a mint condition artifact from the first 100-year observance of the Civil War. And I think there's still some of those over there. And if you didn't get one of those, please help yourself. And then, as was mentioned, I did bring some copies of, this is actually not the most recent copy, but this is one in which I wrote an article entitled North or South, Finding Your Kentucky Civil War Ancestor. And it's an article designed to help you figure out if you had someone in your family tree that did, in fact, either live in or certainly serve in the Civil War that was from Kentucky. And if we run out of those, if you'll contact me at the History Center in Frankfurt, I'll be glad to try to give you one of those. Well, let's look at my talk. And while I've just made some assumptions, here's something that I have run into over the years And I have heard and seen every single one of these statements in the time that I've been working at the Kentucky History Center. Now notice, my wife said when she saw this talk a week ago that it might be confusing, but notice at the top, these are myths about the Civil War in Kentucky, and all of these statements are not true. They are not true. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. They're all black and white, not true, okay? So if you all have come tonight with any of these ideas, I hope you will put those ideas in the myth category from now on. First of all, it is a myth that Kentucky seceded from the Union. That is not a true statement. Second of all, Kentucky, I have actually had people write to me asking information on the Civil War and saying that they understood that Kentucky did not provide any men for the armies during the Civil War. And as you'll find out in a minute, that's absolutely not true. I don't know what those 140,000 guys that were out, either the Confederate or Union Army were, but if you say they didn't provide armies, men to those armies, that would not be a true statement. The third one is that Kentucky remained neutral throughout the entire Civil War. I've heard that many, many times, and I'll talk about that in greater length, but that's absolutely an untrue statement. It did not remain neutral throughout the entire war. The fourth one is that Eastern Kentucky was totally pro-Union, and that would basically, when you're talking about Eastern Kentucky, probably going from maybe the Garrett County, Madison County area on to the easternmost part of Kentucky. I will tell you where part of this myth came from. It came from the president of Berea College, Dr. William Frost, who after the Civil War was reaching out to the northeastern part of the country for financial support, and in doing that he assured those that he was seeking to give money that, of course, Eastern Kentucky was totally pro-Union, so this is an okay thing. Well, that is not a true statement. There were certainly a lot of Confederates from that area that were active and serving during the Civil War. And finally, the statement that Kentucky was evenly divided between the North and South. Without going into great detail, if you look at, for example, at a map that represents the vote in 1860, which we'll talk about in a minute, you will find that there were definitely different areas in which they were predominantly either pro-Confederate or pro-Union. The one that we can state pretty clearly is that the westernmost part of Kentucky, including the Jackson Purchase, was very strongly pro-Confederate, and that's partly because of the rivers that go through there and the fact that that is really more closely aligned with western Tennessee than it is really the rest of Kentucky, and that was the strongest pro-Confederate part of Tennessee. So, but it's not, I don't think it would at all be a fair statement to say that Kentucky's people were evenly divided in sentiments between the North and South. Well, the actual secession crisis and all that followed that, of course, began and basically came to a culmination in November of 1860 with the presidential election. And I'm sure you're all familiar. I'm going to just briefly comment here on the different men who were running for office of the presidency during that time. When Kentucky voted, the one who received the most votes was actually a gentleman from Tennessee by the name of John Bell. He was a member of the Constitutional Union Party, and the basic platform of that party was preservation of the Union. So the fact that he took the overwhelming majority of votes during the presidential election in November of 1860 indicates that there were a lot of Kentuckians who, beside all the other things that were being debated and discussed in that election campaign, were very interested in the Union being preserved. So that is a pretty clear indication right there at that point in history of what a lot of Kentuckians were feeling. The other three men that, of course, ran were Stephen Douglas from Illinois, the Northern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge, who's a native Kentuckian and who at that time was the Vice President of the United States, and he was, of course, a native Kentuckian. And the one that I'm very proud of, and in the time that I've been in the Kentucky Historical Society, we've re-emphasized that Mr. Abraham Lincoln was also a native Kentuckian. And, of course, he was running as the Republican candidate. I also have a talk I do about Major Robert Anderson, who was the commander at Fort Sumter, as we'll talk about in just a minute. But I have made a statement which has generally got some laughs, that at the beginning of the Civil War, the fight was between three Kentuckians: Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, who was born about 90 miles from where Lincoln was born in Kentucky, down near Bowling Green, and Robert Anderson, who was born in Jefferson County, Kentucky. So the guy at Fort Sumter and the president of the Confederacy and Union were all native-born Kentuckians at the very beginning of the Civil War. It's interesting to note also that Mr. Lincoln did not do well in Kentucky in the 1860 election. He only got a little over 1,000 votes, and you will remember that his wife Mrs. Lincoln was from Fayette County, and that's where her family were from. And he got a total of 5 votes in the entire county of Fayette County, where his wife's family and in-laws came from. So he didn't do well. He came in last in the number of votes that he received from the state of Kentucky in that election. Well, you know, as a result of the 1860 election then, in the next month, December, South Carolina, and on the 20th of December, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and then in the early part of 1861, several other states seceded from the Union, and then went together to create the Confederate States of America down in Montgomery, Alabama in March of 1861. Let's talk a little bit about how that issue of slavery was affected in Kentucky. And certainly Kentucky was a slave-owning state. As you notice there at the very top, Kentucky had the third largest number of slave owners of any of the slave-owning states. I believe one of those other two was Virginia, and I think the third one might have been Georgia. But Kentucky was the third largest number of slave owners. Now, most of the slave owners in Kentucky did not own large numbers of slaves. Sometimes maybe 1, 2, or maybe as many as 20 or 30 on the large farms. Nothing like the large numbers that were owned in some of the deep south states, but it did have the third largest number of individuals in the state that owned slaves. One of the things that was very true was that many Kentuckians were opposed to any interference with slavery. And this is where we get into the unique experience of Kentucky, in that many of the very strongest in Kentucky who were opposed to anything being done about slavery were actually some of the strongest pro-union supporters in the state. Dr. Robert J. Breckinridge, who was probably one of President Lincoln's strongest friends in Kentucky, was also adamantly opposed to Mr. Lincoln doing anything to affect slavery. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also find, and I think it's interesting, I think it was either, well, the 17th of September, so Monday of this week was the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Antietam, which was, in fact, the bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. You know, very shortly after that, President Lincoln announced his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which would lead to the freeing of slaves in all of the states that were in rebellion against the federal government. That was to take place on the 1st of January, 1863. Well, remember the statement I made about the fact that you might think all Union soldiers fought to end slavery. Well, when the initial Emancipation Proclamation was announced and then when it went to effect, there were a large number of Union Kentucky men who immediately submitted their resignations from the Army. I think in virtually all cases, those resignations were denied. Some of the men took a hint, some did not, and resubmitted their resignations again, wanting to get out because they had joined the Army to fight to protect the Union, but they were not willing to fight to end slavery. So when that became one of the major factors that was being fought for, they wanted to separate from the Army. And I found it to be very interesting that the state of Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment, which officially amended the Constitution and ended slavery, if you'll notice there, until 1976. That's not 1876, that's 1976. And apparently I was in the active duty Air Force at the time, and I was not in Kentucky at that time, but I'm told that the legislature decided that since the nation was celebrating its 200th anniversary, it might be good if Kentucky would go ahead and ratify the 13th Amendment. I also understand that there's one state, I believe it's Mississippi, who officially has not ratified the 13th Amendment. They apparently voted, but the paperwork got lost somewhere. So they don't show up on the tables as having actually ratified. But the state of Kentucky did not actually ratify that 13th Amendment until 1976. So that gives you some indication of some of the very interesting and mixed views, and we'll talk a little bit more about the views on slavery and those issues and how they pertain here in Kentucky. Well, as I mentioned, after South Carolina seceded and then several other